The rain had been falling all afternoon, cold, steady, and gray, turning the sidewalks of downtown Chicago into slick mirrors that reflected streetlights and passing headlights like broken stars. By early evening, most people had hurried indoors, collars turned up, hands stuffed deep in pockets, eager to escape the damp chill. But one figure remained outside, pressed against the brick wall beside the entrance of a restaurant called La Notte. She wasn't much more than a teenager, though life had already carved lines of worry into her face that didn't belong there. Her clothes were thin and soaked through, clinging to her like second skin. She wore no shoes, just socks darkened by mud and grime, curled slightly at the toes from walking barefoot too long. A small frayed backpack hung from one shoulder, its zipper broken, held shut with a safety pin. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, and her stomach growled so loudly it almost drowned out the distant hum of traffic. La Notte wasn't just any restaurant. It was the kind of place where people made reservations weeks in advance. Crystal glasses, white tablecloths, candles flickering in glass holders, everything about it whispered elegance. Through the large front windows she could see warm light spilling over polished wood floors, waiters gliding between tables with trays held high, and in the far corner, a grand piano. Black, gleaming, silent. She'd passed this place before, always from the outside, always too afraid to go in. But tonight was different. Tonight hunger had sharpened into something desperate. She knew she couldn't ask for money. People barely looked at her when she stood on corners with a cardboard sign. But music was different. Music was something she still owned, even when everything else had been taken. Taking a deep breath, she pushed off the wall and walked toward the door. Her feet left faint wet prints on the stone steps. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of garlic, rosemary, and something sweet, maybe tiramisu. A few diners glanced up as she entered, then quickly looked away, pretending not to notice the dripping girl in the doorway. Behind a small podium near the entrance stood a man in a dark suit, neatly combed hair, holding a leather-bound reservation book. He raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything right away. He'd seen all kinds: tourists lost, delivery guys with wrong addresses, even the occasional street performer hoping for tips. But this girl, she didn't look like she was here to cause trouble. She looked like she was barely holding on. She stopped a few feet from the podium, arms wrapped around herself, trying to stop shaking. "Excuse me," she said, her voice softer than she intended, almost lost in the low murmur of conversation and clinking silverware. The man leaned forward slightly. "Yes?" She swallowed hard. I don't have any money, but I can play piano." She nodded toward the grand piano in the corner. "If I play, could I just have a plate of food? Anything. Pasta, bread, even soup." He blinked. For a moment, he didn't respond. He studied her, the hollows under her eyes, the way her fingers trembled, the quiet dignity in her posture despite everything. He'd been in this business long enough to spot a scam, but this didn't feel like one. This felt real. Too real. "You play?" he asked gently. She nodded. "Since I was 6. And you're not here to ask for cash? Just food?" "Just food," she said. "I promise I won't bother anyone. 5 minutes. If people don't like it, I'll leave." He glanced around. The restaurant was about 3/4 full. Mostly couples, a few small groups, all dressed nicely, enjoying their evenings. No one seemed upset by her presence yet. And the piano hadn't been played all week. The usual weekend performer was out sick. He sighed, then gave a small nod. "All right. 5 minutes. Play something nice, nothing too loud or strange. If the guests enjoy it, you'll get a meal. If not." He didn't finish the sentence, but she understood. Relief washed over her so strongly she nearly swayed on her feet. "Thank you," she whispered. "Really? Thank you." He gestured toward the piano. "Go ahead." She walked slowly across the room, her wet socks making faint squishing sounds on the hardwood floor. A few diners watched her curiously, but most went back to their meals. She reached the piano and ran a hand over its smooth surface. It felt cool, solid, familiar, like an old friend she hadn't seen in years. She sat on the bench, adjusted her posture, and placed her hands over the keys. For a moment, she just stared at them, ivory and ebony, clean and perfect. Her own hands were rough, chapped, nails bitten down. She closed her eyes and thought of her mother, who used to sit beside her on their old upright piano in their tiny apartment, humming along as she practiced scales. Music isn't just notes, her mom used to say. It's how you tell people what your heart can't say out loud. She took a slow breath. Then without fanfare, she began to play. The first notes were quiet, just a simple melody, gentle and a little sad. But within seconds, something shifted in the room. A woman at a nearby table stopped mid-sentence. A waiter paused with a tray of wine glasses. Even the clatter from the kitchen seemed to hush. Because what came from that piano wasn't just sound. It was a story. A story of loss, of loneliness, of holding on when everything else has slipped away. And though no one knew her name or her past, they all felt it. The ache in every note, the hope tucked between the chords. Outside, the rain kept falling. But inside La Notte, time seemed to slow. And in that moment, the girl who had walked in with nothing but hunger and a memory of music suddenly had the full attention of everyone in the room. Not because she asked for it, but because her song gave them something they didn't know they needed. 2 years ago, life looked completely different. Back then, there was a small apartment on the 3rd floor of a brick building, with peeling paint but big windows that let in golden afternoon light. There was a second-hand upright piano squeezed into the living room, its keys slightly yellowed but still warm under small, careful fingers. And there was a woman, tired-eyed but always smiling, who worked double shifts as a home health aide but never missed a single piano recital, no matter how small. Music wasn't just a hobby. It was their language. When words were too heavy or too hard to find, they played instead. A lullaby before bed, a cheerful tune on Saturday mornings while making pancakes. Even on the hardest days, when bills piled up or the radiator broke in winter, they'd sit side by side at the piano, playing something simple just to remind each other they weren't alone. School was tough, but music class was home. Teachers noticed right away. The way she listened, the way her hands moved like they already knew the song before it was taught. By age 12, she was playing pieces most kids twice her age struggled with. A local arts program offered her a scholarship, free lessons, access to practice rooms, even a chance to perform in real concerts. For the first time, the future felt wide open, like a door swinging open onto something bright, but then everything changed in the space of a single week. It started with a cough, just a dry, nagging cough that wouldn't go away. Then came the fever. Then the hospital visits. The tests. The hushed voices in hallways. The words no child should ever have to hear. It's serious. We're doing everything we can. You'll need to be strong. She tried to be strong. She practiced piano while sitting in hospital waiting rooms. She brought sheet music to the bedside, playing soft melodies on a tiny keyboard the nurses let her borrow. She held her mother's hand through every treatment, every sleepless night, every moment of fear disguised as calm. And then, one quiet morning in early spring, the hand went still. The world didn't end with a bang. It ended with silence. The kind of silence that echoes louder than any scream. After that, everything unraveled fast. Without her mother's income, rent became impossible. The landlord was kind at first, gave them a month's grace, but kindness runs out when bills keep piling up. They packed what they could into garbage bags and a single suitcase. The piano stayed behind. She cried the whole way to the shelter, clutching a folder of sheet music like it was a lifeline. At first, the shelter felt temporary, just a stopgap until things got better. But better never came. Social services tried to help, but the system was overwhelmed. She was too old for foster care, too young to live alone. Paperwork got lost, calls went unanswered. And slowly, invisibly, she slipped through the cracks. She learned to survive. She slept in 24-hour laundromats when the shelter was full. She washed up in public restrooms. She ate from food pantries or scavenged half-finished meals left behind at fast food places. She kept her sheet music tucked inside her backpack, wrapped in a plastic bag to keep it dry. Every few days, she'd find a church with an open piano, or a community center that let kids practice. She'd play for 10 minutes, 15 if no one shooed her away, just to feel normal again. But music wasn't just comfort. It became her only real currency. On good days, she'd sit near subway entrances with an open case and play. Sometimes people dropped coins. Sometimes they stopped and listened. Once, a woman handed her a sandwich and said, "You sound like you've got angels in your fingers." She remembered that, held on to it like a secret treasure. Still, the streets were hard. Cold in winter, dangerous at night, lonely always. She learned to keep her head down, to trust no one, to move before anyone got too curious. She missed school, not just the learning but the routine, the feeling of belonging somewhere. But going back wasn't simple. You needed an address, a guardian, things she didn't have. So she played, and played, and played. Her music changed over time. It wasn't just classical pieces anymore. It was everything she felt: grief, hope, anger, longing, poured into melodies she made up herself. She wrote a song for the first snowfall after her mother died, another for the stray cat that followed her for 3 blocks one night, and one, the one she'd been working on for months, she called Mama's Lullaby. It started soft like a whisper, then swelled into something tender but strong, like love that doesn't end. Even when someone's gone, she never planned to play it for strangers. It felt too personal, too raw. But tonight, standing in that warm restaurant with her stomach empty and her heart pounding, she knew it was the only thing she had left to give. Not for fame, not for money, just to say, I'm still here, and this is how I remember her. As her fingers touched the keys earlier, she hadn't thought about the audience. She hadn't thought about the food she hoped to earn. She'd just closed her eyes and let the music carry her back to that sunlit apartment, to the sound of her mother humming off-key in the kitchen, to the feeling of being loved completely and without question. And now, as the first notes filled the room, she didn't know it yet, but those 5 minutes were about to change everything. Not because she asked for help, but because she offered something real, something true, something only she could give. Outside, the city kept moving, cars honking, people rushing, life going on as usual. But inside La Notte, something rare was happening. Strangers were connecting, not through words, but through a song born from loss and love. And in that moment, the girl who had nothing suddenly had the most powerful thing of all, the ability to make people feel, deeply, together. She didn't know what would happen next. She only knew she'd played her truth, and sometimes that's enough to start a new beginning. The first note hung in the air like a single drop of rain falling into a still pond. Soft, simple, alone. But then came the second. And the third, and soon the melody began to unfold. Not loud, not flashy, just honest. It started low in the bass keys, slow and steady, like a heartbeat trying to remember how to keep going. Then the right hand joined in, light and tender, like someone reaching out in the dark, hoping to find a hand to hold. At first, only a few people noticed. A couple near the window paused their conversation. A waiter carrying a tray of steaming risotto slowed his steps. But within 10 seconds something shifted. The clinking of forks stopped. The murmur of voices faded. Even the kitchen door, usually swinging open with bursts of noise and heat, stayed still, because this wasn't just music. It was a feeling. The song didn't have words, but it told a story everyone in the room somehow understood. It spoke of missing someone, of nights that felt too long, of holding on to love even when the person you loved was gone. There was sadness in it, yes, but also warmth, like a memory that hurts but you wouldn't give it up for anything. A woman at table 7, dressed in a soft blue dress, silver hair neatly pinned back, froze with her wine glass halfway to her lips. Her eyes filled so fast she didn't even try to blink it away. She reached across the table and grabbed her husband's hand like she was afraid she'd float away if she let go. He didn't say anything. He just squeezed back, his own throat tight. At the bar, a man in a rumpled suit who'd been scrolling on his phone slowly lowered it to the counter. He stared at the piano, his jaw working like he was trying not to cry in public. He hadn't thought about his own mother in years. Not really, but suddenly he could smell her perfume, hear her humming while folding laundry. He took a shaky breath and looked down at his drink. Even the staff stood still. The host who'd let her play watched from the podium, arms crossed, but his usual composed expression had softened. One of the line cooks peeked through the pass window, wiping his hands on his apron, eyes glistening. The head chef, a big man with tattoos up both arms and a reputation for yelling, stood in the kitchen doorway, arms folded, silent for once. He'd heard thousands of sounds in his career, sizzling pans, chopping knives, shouting orders. But this was different. This was quiet enough to hear your own heart. And the girl? She didn't look up. She kept her eyes closed, fingers moving like they had a mind of their own. She wasn't playing for them. She was playing for the woman who used to tuck her in at night, for the apartment that smelled like cinnamon and old books, for all the things she'd lost and still carried inside. The music built slowly, not with drama but with truth. A gentle rise in the melody, like sunlight breaking through clouds, a pause that felt like a breath held too long, then a cascade of notes that shimmered like tears falling on piano keys. At one point, a child, maybe 6 years old, tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Why is everyone so quiet?" she whispered. Her mother put a finger to her lips, then gently pulled her close. "Because someone's telling a story," she whispered back. "And it's a very important one." By the time the song reached its final phrases, the whole room felt like it was holding its breath. The melody softened again, returning to that simple, steady heartbeat from the beginning. But now it felt different, less lonely. Like the pain hadn't gone away, but it had been shared, and sharing it made it lighter. When the last note faded, there was a full 3 seconds of silence. Not awkward, not empty. Just full. Full of everything that had just passed between strangers who'd walked in as individuals and now felt somehow connected. Then, someone clapped. Just one pair of hands at first. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire restaurant was on its feet. Not polite applause. Real, raw, grateful applause. People were wiping their eyes, nodding, some even mouthing thank you toward the piano, though they didn't know her name. She opened her eyes, startled. She hadn't expected this. She'd expected maybe a nod, maybe a plate of food handed quietly to her in the back. Not this. This wave of warmth rolling toward her like she'd done something heroic. She looked down at her hands, still resting on the keys, as if they'd betrayed her by saying too much. But then she saw the host walking toward her, not with a menu or a check, but with something in his hands. He stopped in front of the piano, his eyes red-rimmed. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he placed a clean white napkin on the bench beside her, folded neatly like it mattered. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Not money. A business card. You have a gift," he said, voice rough. "Not just talent. A gift, that song. It reminded me of my sister. She passed last year. I haven't been able to listen to music since." He swallowed. "Thank you for playing." She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded, clutching the napkin like an anchor. More people approached, not crowding her, just stopping nearby to say a quiet word. "Beautiful. You moved me. Can I buy you dinner?" One older gentleman left a generous tip in the empty tip jar on the piano, though she hadn't even put it out. But the real surprise came when the chef walked over. He didn't say much, just gestured toward the kitchen. "Come on," he said. "You're eating tonight, and not just a plate. A real meal. Whatever you want." She hesitated. I don't want to be a bother." "You're not a bother," he said firmly. "You gave us something. Now let us give you something back." As she followed him toward the kitchen, the clapping hadn't stopped. It followed her like a gentle wave. She kept her head down, but a small, trembling smile touched her lips. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. And as she sat at a small table in the warm, noisy kitchen, steam rising from a bowl of fresh pasta, garlic bread on the side, a glass of water with lemon, she realized something. She hadn't just played for food, she'd played for connection. And somehow, in 5 short minutes, she'd found it. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of a small room she'd never seen before. Soft blankets. A real bed. A door that locked from the inside. It felt unreal, like waking up inside someone else's life. She hadn't gone back to the streets after that meal at La Notte. The chef, after watching her eat like she hadn't seen real food in weeks, had called the owner, who lived in an apartment above the restaurant. Within an hour, they'd offered her a place to stay. Just for a few nights, they said, until she figured things out. She'd protested at first, pride flaring up like an old habit. But the host had simply said, "You gave us something last night we can't repay with money. Let us do this." Now, sitting on the edge of the bed in clean sweatpants and a soft t-shirt someone had left for her, she stared at her hands. They didn't look different, but everything else did. By midday, the restaurant was buzzing, not just with lunch guests, but with people who'd heard what happened the night before. A local news reporter showed up, not with cameras at first, just a notebook and a kind voice. "We heard about the piano," she said. "Would you be willing to talk? Just a short piece. No pressure." She almost said no. The idea of strangers knowing her story made her stomach twist. But then she thought of her mother, how she always said, If your light can help someone else find their way, don't hide it. So she agreed. Just a few sentences. Just enough to say thank you. That short interview ran online that evening. By morning, it had been shared thousands of times. People called it the 5-minute miracle. Others called it the song that healed a room. Comments poured in, some from musicians, some from grieving parents, some from teenagers who'd felt invisible too. One message stood out. You made me feel less alone tonight. Thank you. But the real turning point came 2 days later when an older man walked into La Notte during lunch. He wore a tweed jacket, wire-rimmed glasses, and carried a worn leather briefcase. He didn't ask for a table. He asked for her. I was there that night, he said when they sat down in a quiet corner. I've been teaching music at the conservatory for 40 years. Retired now, but I still listen. He paused, choosing his words carefully. What you played, it wasn't just skill. It was soul. And soul like that shouldn't be lost. He didn't offer her money. He offered something rarer, opportunity. He knew people. He could help her re-enroll in school, get access to practice rooms, even connect her with a mentor who believed in second chances. You don't need saving, he said gently. You just need a door held open. She listened, heart pounding. It sounded too good to be true. But his eyes were steady, his voice calm, not pitying, just believing. And that made all the difference. Still, she didn't say yes right away. That night she sat alone in the restaurant after closing. The piano bathed in moonlight from the street. She played softly, not for anyone, just to think. Was this real? Or just a dream that would vanish like so many others? The host found her there. He didn't interrupt. Just leaned against the bar and listened. When she finished, he said, You don't have to trust the world yet, but maybe trust this part of it. We're not asking for anything. Just a chance to help. Something in his voice, the lack of expectation, finally loosened the knot in her chest. She nodded. Okay, she whispered. I'll try. Within a week, things began to move. The retired teacher arranged a meeting with the director of a community arts program. They reviewed her old school records, listened to a recording of Mama's Lullaby, and offered her a full scholarship, not just for lessons, but for housing support, counseling, even a small stipend so she wouldn't have to worry about food. But she insisted on working. I want to earn my place, she told them. So La Notte hired her, not as a charity case, but as their weekend pianist. Every Friday and Saturday night she'd play for 2 hours. Not sad songs all the time. Sometimes jazz, sometimes light classical, sometimes even cheerful old standards that made couples smile and tap their feet. But once, always once, she'd play Mama's Lullaby. Not for attention. Just to remember, and to remind others that love doesn't disappear, it changes shape. Donations started coming in, not to her, but to a fund set up in her name to help other young people with talent, but no safety net. She didn't control the money, but she helped choose who it went to. A boy who painted murals on cardboard, a girl who wrote poetry in a shelter. Each one reminded her of herself, just needing one person to say, I see you. Months passed. She started school again, made friends, real ones, who didn't ask about her past unless she brought it up. She learned to sleep through the night without jumping at every sound. She bought her first pair of real shoes with her first paycheck. Small things, but they felt like victories. One evening, as she played at La Notte, she noticed a familiar face in the crowd, the woman in the blue dress from that first night. She was back, this time alone. After the set, she approached, eyes shining. I come every week now, she said. My husband passed last month. But hearing you play, it helps me feel close to him again. They hugged. No words needed. That's when she truly understood. Her music wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd ever loved and lost, hoped and hurt. And that was okay. Better than okay, it was purpose. She still carried her old backpack, though it was cleaner now, zipped properly. Inside, she kept the original sheet music for Mama's Lullaby, slightly smudged but carefully preserved. And tucked in the front pocket, a note her mother had written years ago. Play like your heart is speaking. She did. Every single time, and now, instead of playing to eat, she played to give. Not because she had to, but because she finally could. 6 months after that rainy night at La Notte, the city's historic concert hall, usually reserved for seasoned professionals and visiting orchestras, was filled with an unusual kind of energy. Not the hushed formal silence of typical classical events, but a warm, buzzing anticipation like people were gathering not just to hear music, but to witness something real. Backstage, she stood in a simple black dress, no sequins, no fancy heels, just comfortable shoes and a small silver locket around her neck, the only thing she'd kept from her old life. Her hands weren't shaking this time, not because she wasn't nervous, but because she knew why she was here. This wasn't about proving herself, it was about sharing. The program listed her piece as Mama's Lullaby reimagined for orchestra. She'd spent weeks working with a young composer from the conservatory, turning her solo piano melody into something grander. Strings swelling beneath the piano line, a soft cello echoing the bass notes, flutes weaving through like memories floating on air. But at its heart, it was still the same song she'd played that night with wet socks and an empty stomach. Out in the audience sat people from every chapter of her journey. The host from La Notte, now more like family, sat in the third row with his wife. The retired music teacher beamed from a center aisle seat, arms crossed like a proud grandfather. The woman in the blue dress was there too, holding a tissue but smiling. And near the back, a group of teenagers from the shelter, some she'd helped through the fund, sat wide-eyed, dressed in borrowed clothes, seeing for the first time that their dreams weren't too big for their circumstances. When the lights dimmed and she walked onto the stage, the applause wasn't polite. It was loud, full of warmth, like a welcome home. She bowed quickly, sat at the grand piano, this one even more beautiful than the one at La Notte, and placed her fingers on the keys. She didn't start right away. She closed her eyes, took a breath, and thought of her mother's hands on the old upright piano, of rainy sidewalks, of the smell of garlic and rosemary in a warm kitchen when she had nothing else. Then she began. The first notes were just as they'd been that night, soft, honest, a little broken. But now they were answered. A violin joined in, then a cello, then the whole string section rising like a tide of shared feeling. The music grew, not louder but deeper, like grief and love had finally learned to live in the same room. Halfway through, she opened her eyes. She saw tears on faces, saw people holding hands, saw a young boy in the front row, maybe 10 years old, staring at the piano like he'd just discovered magic. And in that moment she understood. This wasn't just her story anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd ever been told they didn't matter, who'd been overlooked, who'd played their heart out in silence, hoping someone would listen. When the final chord faded into silence, the hall didn't erupt right away. For a few seconds it was just stillness, deep, respectful, full. Then, like a wave building from the back, the audience rose, not just standing, but clapping with everything they had. Some cheered. Some cried openly. The teenagers from the shelter jumped up, grinning, clapping so hard their hands must have hurt. She stood, bowing again, tears streaming down her face, not from sadness, but from the sheer weight of being seen, truly seen and accepted, not despite her past, but because of it. After the concert, there was a small reception in the lobby. People lined up to speak with her, not for autographs, but for connection. A man told her he'd brought his daughter, who'd stopped playing piano after her grandmother died. She hasn't touched the keys in a year, he said. But tonight, she whispered, I want to play again. Another woman, a social worker, asked if she'd consider visiting shelters to give short performances or workshops. You give them hope, she said simply. She said yes to everything that felt right. Not out of obligation, but because she finally had something to give. A few weeks later, she launched a small nonprofit called Open Keys. The idea was simple. Find young people with artistic talent who were struggling, homeless, in foster care, living on the edge, and give them what she'd been given, a chance. Not handouts, opportunities, access to instruments, practice space, mentors, and most importantly, belief. The first student was a boy who rapped poetry into a cracked phone while sleeping in a bus station. The second was a girl who painted murals on cardboard boxes. Neither had ever been told their art mattered. Now they had a studio, supplies, and someone who listened. And every Friday night, without fail, she returned to La Notte. Not because she needed the money, she didn't anymore, but because it was where it all began. Where someone had said 5 minutes. Where strangers had cried not out of pity, but because her truth had touched theirs. She still played Mama's Lullaby once during her set. Sometimes people recognized it and fell quiet. Sometimes new guests asked what it was called. She'd just smile and say, "It's a thank you song." Years later, when people asked how she turned her life around, she never talked about talent or luck. She talked about kindness, about the host who took a chance, the chef who offered a meal, the teacher who saw potential, the audience that listened with their hearts. She knew better than anyone that one moment doesn't fix everything. Hunger doesn't vanish in 5 minutes. Grief doesn't disappear. But sometimes in the space between one note and the next, a door opens. And if someone's willing to walk through it, and if others are willing to hold it open, whole new worlds can begin. Now, when she plays, she doesn't just hear music. She hears all the voices that said yes when the world said no, and she plays for them too, because in the end, the most powerful songs aren't the ones that show off skill. They're the ones that say you're not alone, and that's a melody worth sharing again and again. A few weeks after the gala, life didn't just change, it flipped completely upside down. The video of that piano performance had been shared everywhere, not just on fancy classical music pages, but on regular people's feeds too. Someone had filmed it from their phone near the dessert table, and the way the camera shook when the music got intense somehow made it feel even more real. Within days, millions had watched it. Comments poured in, "Who is she?" This gave me chills. Why was she serving drinks? At first, it was overwhelming. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Old classmates from music school reached out, some with kind words, others with awkward apologies for losing touch. A few local news stations called, wanting interviews. She said no to most of them. She wasn't looking for fame, she just wanted to play. But one offer kept coming back, and this one felt different. It wasn't from a big concert hall or a record label. It was from a small community arts center in the Bronx, the kind of place with peeling paint but warm hearts. They'd seen the video and asked if she'd consider teaching there, maybe even playing a monthly recital. The pay wasn't much, but the mission was clear. Bring music to kids who'd never stepped inside a concert hall, who thought pianos were only for rich people or movie scenes. That she could say yes to. She kept her waitressing job for a while, not because she needed to, but because it grounded her. The regulars at the hotel didn't treat her any differently. Mr. Henderson still asked for extra olives in his martini. The kitchen crew still teased her about burning toast during her early morning shift. And that normalcy was a gift. It reminded her that she hadn't become someone else. She'd just been seen for who she'd always been. Meanwhile, the famous pianist, the one who'd made that cruel joke, didn't disappear. He didn't post a flashy apology on social media or try to ride her wave for clout. Instead, he showed up quietly at the Arts Center one rainy Tuesday afternoon. He didn't announce himself. He just sat in the back row during a kid's workshop, watching as she guided a group of 10-year-olds through simple scales, laughing when one of them played hot cross buns with dramatic flair. Afterward, he waited until everyone had left, then walked over. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, hands in his coat pockets, voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "I spent years believing talent only mattered if it came wrapped in the right package. Fancy schools, designer shoes, the right last name. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just handed her an envelope. Inside was a check, not huge but enough to cover a year of instrument repairs and sheet music for the center. At the bottom, handwritten, "For the next generation of voices we almost missed." She didn't cash it right away. She pinned it to the bulletin board in the music room, next to drawings from her students. It wasn't about the money. It was about the shift, the quiet understanding that even people who've built walls around their pride can sometimes find a way to tear one down. As winter turned to spring, the Arts Center began to buzz with new energy. Kids who used to fidget through lessons now stayed late, practicing on donated keyboards. Parents lingered in the hallway, listening through the door. One Saturday, they held their first open recital. No tuxedos, no tickets, just folding chairs, juice boxes, and nervous smiles. She played last. Not something flashy, but Debussy's Clair de Lune, slow and shimmering like moonlight on a quiet street. When she finished, the room didn't erupt in polite applause. It sat still for a long moment, as if holding its breath. Then a little girl in the front row whispered, "That sounded like magic," and everyone laughed through happy tears. The story kept spreading, but in a different way now. Not as a viral clip, but as word of mouth. "You should see the piano teacher at the Lincoln Arts Center. She used to work at the Grandeur Hotel, you know?" And now she's changing lives. Local businesses started donating. A retired piano tuner volunteered his time. Even the hotel where she'd waited tables offered to sponsor a summer music camp, though she made sure the program stayed free for all kids. No questions asked. She never went back to Juilliard to finish her degree. She didn't need to. What she was doing now felt more like real education anyway. Teaching a shy boy to play his first chord. Watching a teenager compose her own song about her neighborhood. Helping a grandmother learn Für Elise because it was her late husband's favorite. These moments didn't make headlines, but they filled her days with a kind of quiet joy she'd almost forgotten existed. Sometimes, late at night, she'd sit alone at the old upright piano in the center's back room. No audience, no expectations, just her and the keys. And in those moments, she'd play not for anyone else, but for herself, the girl who'd practiced on a keyboard made of cardboard when her family couldn't afford lessons, who'd cried in the staff bathroom after Julian's comment, who'd almost given up. Now every note was a thank you to that younger self for not walking away. The world kept turning. New scandals, new trends, new viral stars came and went. But in that unassuming building in the Bronx, something lasting was growing. Not fame, not fortune, but connection. Music became a bridge, not a barrier. And the woman who once served champagne to people who wouldn't look her in the eye was now the one holding the door open for others. One evening, as she locked up the center, she saw a teenager lingering by the steps, headphones on, staring at the piano through the window. "You okay?" she asked. The kid shrugged. "Just never seen someone who looks like me play like that." She unlocked the door. "Come on in," she said. "Let's see what you've got." And just like that, the next chapter began. Not with a grand stage or a spotlight, but with a simple invitation, a dusty keyboard, and the quiet belief that everyone deserves a chance to be heard. Summer came in hot and sticky, the kind of heat that made the city feel like it was breathing slow and heavy. But inside the Arts Center, the air hummed with something cooler, anticipation. The music camp had started, and for the first time the place was packed not just with kids from the neighborhood, but with students from all over the city. Some came by subway with parents who'd never set foot in this part of town before. Others walked in alone, backpacks slung over one shoulder, eyes wide at the sight of real pianos, violins, even a slightly out-of-tune cello someone had donated. She didn't run the camp like a strict school. There were no uniforms, no rigid schedules. Instead, mornings began with a circle, everyone sitting on the floor sharing what kind of music moved them. One kid talked about his abuela's old boleros. Another played a beat he'd made on his phone using just kitchen pots. She listened more than she spoke, letting their voices shape the day. "Music isn't just notes on a page," she'd say. "It's your story, your heartbeat, your anger, your joy, all turned into sound." One afternoon, a boy who'd barely said 2 words all week lingered after class. He was small for his age, with eyes that darted like he was always watching for trouble. He pointed to the piano. "Can I try something?" She nodded and stepped back. His fingers were stiff at first, clumsy, but then he found a rhythm, simple, raw, repeating. It wasn't classical. It wasn't even correct by textbook standards. But it had feeling, real feeling. When he finished, he looked up, half expecting to be told it was wrong. Instead, she smiled. "That's yours, isn't it?" He nodded, surprised. "Yeah, I made it up last night. In my head." "Then it's perfect," she said. And just like that, he stood a little taller. Word got around that this wasn't just a place to learn scales. It was a place where your voice mattered, even if it cracked or wobbled. Enrollment doubled by the second week. Volunteers showed up. Retired teachers, college students, even a jazz drummer who'd once played with legends but now just wanted to pass it on. No one got paid much, but no one seemed to care. There was a different kind of currency here. The look on a kid's face when they finally nail a tough passage, or the way a group of strangers start harmonizing on a folk song they just learned together. Then came the invitation. It arrived in a crisp white envelope, delivered by hand. Not email, not a DM, actual paper. Inside was a formal request from a major concert hall downtown. They wanted her to perform a solo recital. Not as a guest, not as a novelty, but as the main artist. The date was set for fall. The program? Entirely her choice. Attached was a note. "We've been listening. The city needs to hear you, not just your hands, but your heart." She stared at it for a long time. Part of her wanted to say no. The stage felt like a different world now, one of judgment, pressure, perfection. But another part remembered the boy who'd played his own song, the little girl who called music magic, the grandmother learning für Elise. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about showing everyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong in a concert hall they did. She said yes. Preparation wasn't glamorous. She practiced late into the night after camp ended, often with kids still doing homework at the tables nearby. Sometimes they'd fall asleep to the sound of Chopin drifting through the room. She chose pieces that told a story, not just of technique but of journey. She included the Rachmaninoff that had stunned the gala crowd, but also a short original composition of her own, built from the rhythms of subway trains, rain on fire escapes, and the hum of city life. And she ended with a piece her own grandmother used to hum while cooking, simple, sweet, full of love. As the performance date neared, something unexpected happened. The community rallied. Parents baked cookies to sell for program printing. Teens designed posters. A local tailor offered to make her a dress. Nothing fancy, he said. Just something that feels like you. She picked deep blue like twilight over the rooftops. The night of the concert, the hall was full. Not just with wealthy patrons, but with families from the neighborhood, camp kids in their best clothes, teachers, even a few former co-workers from the hotel. Backstage, her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of it all. This wasn't just a comeback. It was a homecoming. She walked out to silence. Not the cold silence of judgment, but the warm, waiting silence of people who already believed in her. She sat, took a breath, and began. The music flowed, not perfect, but alive. Every note carried the years of waiting tables, of practicing on broken keyboards, of being told she wasn't enough. And every note also carried the joy of teaching, of seeing a child's eyes light up, of finding her place not on a pedestal, but in the middle of real life. When she finished, the applause didn't feel like noise. It felt like embrace. Afterward, people lined up to speak with her. An older woman held her hands and said, "My grandson's in your camp. He hasn't smiled in months until last week when he played for us at dinner." A teenager handed her a crumpled piece of paper with a melody scribbled on it. "Can you tell me if this makes sense?" Even a critic from a major paper stood quietly in the back, then simply nodded and said, "Thank you for reminding us what music is really for." But the moment that stayed with her happened later, outside the stage door. The boy who'd played his own song was there, holding a small bouquet of daisies he must have picked from a park. "I wrote a new part for it," he said shyly. "Want to hear it?" She crouched down. Always. They sat on the curb under the streetlights, him humming a new line, her nodding along. No grand piano, no spotlight, just two people sharing sound in the quiet night. Back at the Art Center the next week, nothing had changed, and everything had. The same worn chairs, the same slightly sticky piano keys, but now when kids walked in, they stood a little straighter. They knew someone from their world had stood on that big stage and been seen, not as a miracle, not as an exception, but as proof that talent lives everywhere, even in the places people overlook. She never stopped teaching, never stopped listening, and though offers kept coming, TV appearances, recording deals, international tours, she always came back to that room with the peeling paint and the mismatched chairs. Because that's where music wasn't performed. It was lived. And in a world that often shouts, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is play softly and let someone else hear themselves in the echo. Life settled into a new kind of rhythm after the concert. Not quieter exactly, but deeper. The buzz from that night didn't fade overnight, but it changed shape. Instead of strangers stopping her on the street asking, "Are you the waitress who played piano?" people now said things like, "My kid's in your Saturday group. They haven't missed a week." Or, "I heard you take beginners." "I'm 62. Is it too late?" She always smiled and said, "It's never too late to start listening to your own voice." The Art Center grew, but not in the flashy way people expected. There were no billboards or grand reopenings, just small, steady steps. A local woodworker built proper music stands. A retired librarian started a lending shelf of sheet music. Someone donated a second-hand upright piano that needed tuning but had a warm, round tone, perfect for beginners. Every addition felt like a shared secret between the neighborhood and the space, like they were all building something together, brick by musical note. One rainy Thursday, a woman walked in holding a toddler on her hip and a folder under her arm. She looked tired. The kind of tired that comes from working 2 jobs and still not sleeping enough. "I saw your flyer at the laundromat," she said. "Do you really let adults learn, even if they've never touched an instrument?" She explained she used to sing in church as a girl, but life got in the way. Bills, kids, loss. Now with her youngest in school, she wanted to try again. Not to be famous, just to feel that joy again. "Even if I'm bad?" she asked, almost whispering. "Especially if you're bad," came the reply. "That's where the real music starts." That became a quiet rule. No one was too old, too late, too rough around the edges. The center wasn't about creating stars. It was about giving people a place to be human, with all their stumbles, hopes, and half-formed dreams. Then came the letter from the city. At first, she thought it was a bill. But it wasn't. It was an official notice the building was being considered for landmark status. Not because of its architecture, it was modest, even plain, but because of what happened inside. A city council member had visited during camp, watched a group of kids perform an original piece about their block, and was moved enough to start the paperwork. "This place," the letter read, "represents the kind of community art that doesn't wait for permission to exist." The news spread fast. Neighbors showed up with coffee and questions. Reporters called again, but this time she agreed to one interview. Not for herself, but for the kids. She sat on the front steps with a group of students, all talking over each other about why the center mattered. "It's the only place my mom lets me walk to alone," said one. "I wrote a song about my dog here," said another. The article ran with a photo of them all crammed on the stoop, laughing, instruments in hand. No filters, no poses, just real. But with attention came pressure. A developer offered to partner with the center. New building, state-of-the-art equipment, his name on the marquee. Everyone knew what that meant. Gentrification wrapped in generosity. She listened politely, then said no. "We don't need shiny floors," she told the team later. "We need space to be messy, to make mistakes, to grow at our own pace." The group agreed. They'd rather stay in their imperfect home than trade soul for polish. Instead, they launched a small fundraiser. Not online, but old school. A weekend music fair in the parking lot. Kids sold lemonade and homemade cookies. Teens performed short sets. A few local bands played for free. Even the woman who'd started lessons at 62 sang a gospel tune that brought tears to more than a few eyes. They raised enough to fix the leaky roof and buy new strings for the guitars. More importantly, they reminded everyone that this place belonged to the people in it. Not to investors, not to algorithms, but to the community. One evening, as she was locking up, she found a folded piece of notebook paper tucked under the door. Inside was a poem written in careful cursive. "You didn't just teach me piano, you taught me I was worth hearing, no name." Just those 2 lines. She taped it to the wall beside the old concert program and the check from the famous pianist. These weren't trophies. They were reminders. Months passed. Seasons turned. The camp ran again in summer, bigger than before. This time, some of the older students helped teach the younger ones. Leadership wasn't handed down. It grew naturally like vines on a fence. One girl who'd once been too shy to play alone now led a beginners group with gentle patience. A boy who used to bang on the keys just to make noise now composed short pieces about his little sister. Progress wasn't measured in recitals, but in moments. A hesitant chord played with confidence, a shared laugh over a wrong note, the quiet pride in a parent's eyes. Then, something small but huge happened. The local high school, once known more for its metal detectors than its music program, asked if she'd help restart their band. Budget cuts had gutted it years ago. Now with student interest rising, they wanted to try again. She didn't take a salary. She just showed up twice a week, bringing donated instruments and a belief that every kid deserved access to art, not just those who could afford it. The first rehearsal was chaos. Trumpets squeaked. Drumsticks rolled under chairs. A flute played a note so sharp it made someone yelp, but no one laughed. They just tried again. And again. By the 3rd week, they were playing a simple march. Sloppy, yes, but together. That togetherness was the real victory. One afternoon, after school let out, she stayed late to help a student tune a violin. Outside, the sun dipped low, painting the walls gold. In that quiet moment, she realized something. She wasn't the waitress who stunned the elite anymore. That story had served its purpose. It opened a door. But what she'd built since? That was her real legacy. Not a single performance, but 1,000 small acts of courage, curiosity, and connection. She never went back to the luxury hotel. Not because she held a grudge, but because she didn't need to prove anything to that world anymore. Her world was here, where a wrong note wasn't failure, but part of the process. Where a child's first melody was as valuable as any symphony. Where music wasn't a luxury, but a lifeline. And on the nights when the city felt too loud or too lonely, she'd sit at the piano in the empty center, play something soft and simple, and remember, the most powerful music isn't the kind that silences a room. It's the kind that helps someone find their own voice and finally feel brave enough to use it.